Hi everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today I want to demonstrate how you can use cereal dilutions to create a fade set on some 20-gram mini skeins of sock yarn. Cereal dilutions are a series of consecutive dilutions where in each step you are diluting your solution by the same amount. So today we're going to start with a stock solution that we mix, and then we will make a dilution that is half the strength, a quarter, an eighth, and a 16th. So each time we will be doing a dilution by half, and this will give us a beautiful gradient that we can see on these mini skeins. In the lab, cereal dilutions are a really great way to get something that is fairly dilute, but it's really hard to measure out a really small weight of a powder, so you can make a more concentrated stock and then dilute it to get to the final concentration that you want. Today we are going to be using a fairly old dye stock of some Dharma Fire Engine Red. This started as a 1% stock solution. I'm not sure what the concentration really is now because, as I said, it's old, but we will be starting with this and then proceeding. The mini skeins are all 75% Superwash merino, 25% nylon, and I'm going to let this total of 100 grams of yarn pre-soak in just some plain tap water for at least 20 minutes. We will move over to our little 1-quart mason jars once I am ready to start the dyeing. But first we need to mix our dye stocks. Now, into 1 cup I added all of the remaining dye, which was about 1.5 quarter cups total. And then with the second quarter cup, I filled up the rest of the volume with some tap water. So this is of a unknown actual concentration, but we are starting with, my best guess would be approximately 90 milliliters of the Fire Red stock solution. The reason why I wanted a total volume of half a cup is that it'll make this whole process easier, and then the dye that we're left with in the cups in the end can be added directly to our mason jars. For each of the dilutions, I'm going to take a quarter cup of this stock, add it to a quarter cup of water that's already in the cup, mix this up, take a quarter cup of this dilution, add it to a quarter cup of water, mix it up, leaving a quarter cup of this one behind. And then we'll go on. And so then we'll have our full strength, half, quarter, eighth, and 16th strength colors. So I'm going to measure out a quarter cup, add it there, mix it up, and I'm going to go rinse out this cup. Don't worry, I am saving the rinses. Now we're going to take a quarter cup of this one, add it to a quarter cup of just tap water, quarter cup of this dilution, add it to a quarter cup of plain tap water, and then we're going to take a quarter cup of the dye that we just mixed, and you can see that they are getting lighter and lighter. Add it to a quarter cup of tap water and mix it up. Now that all of these dilutions are complete, there is one more thing to do. If we were to just go and add these onto the yarn as is, because this cup has double the volume, it has still the equivalent amount of dye as we have over here. So I'm going to remove a quarter cup from our last dilution and just set it aside in an empty cup. Of course, you could proceed and make further and further dilutions until you got something that almost had no color. You don't have to do your dilutions by half. You could do these progressive dilutions really any way you want as long as you're consistent. If we had started with a volume of, say, a quarter cup plus a tablespoon here in this first one, and then a 1/4 cup in the rest of the others. We could take a tablespoon and put it in here and mix it up, and then put a tablespoon in this one, and then take a tablespoon, you know, and going down. And that would give us a much steeper gradient. It would be less gradual because you'd be diluting it by more each time. Since the volume in each of these cups is now a 1/4 cup, I'm going to go ahead and pour all of these colors into their respective mason jars. Oops. And I am going to rinse out the remaining color in these cups. I have just added 3/4 of a cup of water to each of these cups, just to rinse it out and to bring the total volume of water in our mason jars up to a cup per jar. And now I'm just going to pour it in. What's different between this gradient and what we did during the math of yarn dyeing? In Dyepot Weekly 117, we were trying to achieve specific depths of shade that we would be able to calculate and reproduce in that way on each of these yarns. This technique can still be equally as reproducible, but you can also start with an approximate knowledge of how much dye you have. Like in this case, when I started with about 1.5 1/4 cups of our approximately 1% stock solution. And so we have an idea of how much dye that we had. By my estimation, there is about equivalent of approximately 45 milliliters of our original dye stock in this jar, which would give us approximately a DOS of 2%. To quickly show the calculations for my approximate math, 1/4 cup of dye is about 60 milliliters, and half of the 1/4 cup, so 1/8 cup volume, is equivalent to about 30 milliliters. So therefore I started with about 90 milliliters of our red 1% stock solution. And since the 1% stock solution is 1 gram of dye per 100 milliliters, that is approximately 0.9 grams of dye. Just another quick reminder of definition that when we talk about the depth of shade as a percent, this refers to the grams of dye per 100 grams of fiber times 100 to turn that decimal into the percent. So in our first jar, we had half of that original dye stock. So we had approximately 0.45 grams of dye for those 20 grams of wool that we'll put in momentarily. That is an equivalent of 2.25 grams of dye for 100 grams of wool. So just multiplying this amount by 5, which would give us a DOS of 2.25%. All of this is really approximate because I am making a number of assumptions. The 90 milliliters that I'm using is an estimate, as is the 1% stock solution. But this does give us sort of an idea that our deepest shade is approximately 2%. And therefore our palest shade is 1/16 of this, so it would be around 0.14% DOS. Now, the further I'm off with my estimation for the amount of dye and the concentration of the stock solution, and therefore the DOS of the deepest shade, that will propagate even further. So depending on how far I'm off would depend on how far I'm off with the lightest shade. So I have an estimate for the approximate depth of shade. It's something that I know will work. It's something that I know will give us a saturated color. And so therefore I know that this progression will work pretty nicely. I hope that these estimated calculations help, because as long as you know you're going to get a good level of saturation for your deepest shade, it doesn't matter what the absolute DOS is for the paler shades, because you know that they will be paler in a consistent way relative to the way that you mixed this deepest shade, which hopefully makes some sense. What we wouldn't be able to do with this after the fact is look at the palest shade and be like, ooh, this is X% DOS. Okay, I want to achieve that exact color again. I'm just going to go straight for that and mix it, because we could be off a little bit. But if you are sure in the amount of dye that you have at the deepest one, then you could accurately go back and calculate how much dye was in each of the other ones. I'm now going to add 1 teaspoon of white vinegar to each of our jars. And then starting at the lightest, I'm going to go mix them up. I'm now going to start adding the yarn to our jars. But I guess the real important thing is that you are not limited to going full on quantitative with calculations or full on qualitative with no calculations. You can use sort of a combination of both and just sort of go for it. But the serial dilutions is a little easier than doing all of the calculations that I did in the other math of yarn dyeing episodes. And again, going from lightest to darkest, I am going to make sure everything is nice and submerged. I have now placed the 5 jars into my steamer basket, which is actually the pasta insert of my multi-pot. And I've added the water level so that the water level in this double boiler setup is about just below the water line. The bath started off cool, so I just started heating it up. I'm going to place the lid on and then come check back in about 20 minutes. But if I get any vigorous boiling, I will turn down the temperature. It's been 20 minutes, and checking with the darkest color, there is a tiny bit of color left in there. I'd say the palest one is clear. The medium one is getting close. I am going to go ahead and turn off the stove, but I'm going to leave this with the lid on for at least another 20 minutes and let it cool off in here, so we are getting some more heat, so hopefully we can absorb all of the color in the darkest one. So I'll come back and check in about 20 minutes. Okay, let's check. I'm very happy with this gradient that we're seeing. Oof, that is a really nice red. There is a hint of color left in our darkest one. I would say the rest are probably about clear. I'm gonna leave the lid off and let things cool off here in the steam pot until I can sort of comfortably pick up and safely remove these glass jars. Let's leave none of this color behind. I have a room temperature, maybe slightly warm, dye bath that we used for as our double boiler for our jars. And I put in 100 grams of Knit Picks Simply Wool yarn. This yarn is 100% eco wool. It's non-superwash, and it comes in this beautiful natural pale gray color. Let's use some of this leftover color. We've got that 1/4 cup that we saved behind. Rinsing out this cup a bit. And then we have all this rinsing that I've done from our original stock solution bottle. Which, hey, this is getting it nice and clean for me. So again, there's no acid in here yet. I did add a zip tie. I'm just gently moving the yarn through so that way it can access the color. Now I'm going to turn on the heat, start heating it up, and we need some acid. Okay, that's about half of a tablespoon. Let's go ahead and add 2 healthy splashes of vinegar to our pot. I'm expecting that we're going to get a lovely semi-solid yarn in here because of the way that the dye can access the yarn. And I'm really curious to see what the actual colors will look like. I'm going to leave this, I think, for, goodness, about 20 minutes, and then we'll come back and check on it. Within 20 minutes of turning the pot on, the water is clear. Maybe there's like a hint of like a yellow in there, but I'm going to turn off the heat, let the yarn cool off completely in the pot, and then once it's cool, we'll go wash it along with our mini skeins. These colors are so much fun. You can see that we've got all the way from a saturated red all the way down to a medium toned pink. We could have taken this further, or as I was describing earlier, we could have done stronger dilutions to get to a more pastel color at the end. But I am really, really happy with how this has come out. The yarn has all cooled, so let's remove them from the jars, and then we can go wash it. Yeah, the lightest 2 have cleared, and actually, when they were in the jars, it was really easy to distinguish between those 2, but out of the jars, they look a little bit more similar. But I do think that I'd be able to tell the difference in the end. And then finally, all right, so our most saturated friend does have a little bit of color left in the jar. It is a pink that is really pale. And so pale that on the spoon that color does not even really register, which is something I point out because as we're using the leftover color that we also had in the jar as a leave no dye behind on some more yarn, we're going to get probably a fairly pastel color over there. I just wanted to show. But whenever you have anything that is this saturated, you do want to take care to make sure you rinse out any excess dye. But even once you have a really saturated hand-dyed red or really any color, if you want to mix it with, say, a white, do a rinse test first. Wash a swatch, check it with some white yarn to check for bleeding before you see bleeding on a garment. Thankfully, I have not had this be an issue personally, but it's always worth pointing out. Let's wash our beautiful mini skeins. Now I've managed to have a hand through each of them. I do not want to risk tangling this if I can help it. But so far, that first dip looks pretty darn good. I am really, really happy I'm not seeing like insane bleeding or something. Alright, I'm adding some dish soap, and the water, I would call it lukewarm, so it's not just completely cold. Really moving this around in here, and what do we think? I think I see a hint of some bleeding now. But just a hint, so little I'm not sure it registered on camera. I am going to do my very best to wash this until the water runs clear, which, I mean, as you can see, it's basically clear. But what I said before still stands. You want to, with any deep saturated colors, you do want to take care because they could bleed. And things that make acid dye bleed are things like heat. Oh, that's good. We're good. Things that make acid dyes bleed are things like heat or having a basic pH in your rinse water. I am now going to go hang these up to dry and we'll wash our bonus skein. The dye bath for our bonus skein was completely clear. And what's funny is that this color almost looks like a broken pink and purple. But I think that's because we got these tonal pinks and we've got more or less of that original gray showing through, which gives us that sort of purpley quality. But because I didn't move this around in the pot, that's why the color overall was very pastel. It's one of the reasons why we have so much tonal variation in this yarn. If you wanted to have a yarn that was more solid, then start heating it with no acid and slowly add acid. Use a bigger volume of water and move things around very gently because this is 100% wool. But anyway, I am not seeing any bleeding. I'm going to wash this with a little bit of dish soap, then hang it up to dry with the rest of the yarn. Here is the finished gradient that we created with Cereal Dilutions. We have a medium blush pink, all the way to, I think, a true red. We definitely could go more and less saturated with this color. We didn't hit a limit on either end, but we do have a beautiful true gradient from our Cereal Dilutions. I know that I showed some estimates as to how much dye we used, and that maybe this is around approximately a 2% DOS for this red color. However, I think that the real take-home thing here today is that you can create beautiful gradients without having accurate numbers, because by doing these Cereal Dilutions, you are cutting the amount of dye. With the ones we did today, you're cutting the amount of dye in half each time, and so that gives these beautiful steps of color. Now, if you started with a color that was way too dark, you might see multiple shades of red and maybe only one shade of pink at the end. So things could be a little bit more subtle, but I think that that could be fun as well. And if you look back at the math of yarn dyeing with the gradient I created with the black, when we were looking at the black at 4%, 2%, and 1%, they were very similar, but there is definitely a difference that would work beautifully in some kind of fade project. I think that it is important to understand sort of an overview of the way the math works, because the terms like DOS and stock solution concentrations are things that are shared through the community when people are trying to explain how they achieved a particular color. But it is not necessary, unless you want to create something absolutely reproducible, to go through all the calculations each time. As you use colors more and more, you will get a sense of how many milliliters of your stock solution you want to use. Or if you're not doing stock solutions at all, you might get a rough sense of, okay, I want a 1/4 teaspoon of this dye to start with, to then go and do my Cereal Dilutions. As long as you have some consistency yourself, then you can start to create something reproducible. Side note, weighing grams of a powdered dye is always more accurate than measuring out a volume of the powdered dye, but it depends ultimately on the level of accuracy and reproducibility that you want. We took what was left over in our stock bottle, plus the same amount of dye that we used in our palest skein, on 100 grams of a natural colored Knit Picks Simply Wool yarn. We got something that is a lot more dusty colored, but we still have some really great tones. It almost feels broken because in some areas where the gray shines through more with the pastel pink, it looks like a different kind of hue. But it definitely was, I don't think that this color breaks at all. I think that it really is just because it is effectively layered because the base color was not white. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I hope that you found this video helpful. Cereal dilutions like this still definitely involve some level of math, as you're considering how much you want to dilute things in each step. But it is something that also might be easier for someone to get a grasp on than calculating how much of your dye stock you want to add to each of 5 jars. And personally, I hope that showing things in multiple different ways and multiple different times is really, really helpful. And I would be happy to do this again, doing with a different color, doing a sharper gradient, so we get something that starts more saturated and goes into something that is a lot more pastel in the end. Please subscribe to the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel, give this video a like, and let me know what you would like to see more when it comes to some calculations and math involved with the dyeing process. If you're already a fan of ChemKnits or you're a new fan and you want to help support the channel on another level, go and check out the ChemKnits Patreon. ChemKnits patrons get some really cool perks like early access to new yarn dyeing videos, behind the scenes sneak peeks, and more. You can even get some shout outs or permanent coupons to the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. You can find a link to the Patreon in the video description and iCard. Thank you so much for watching, everyone.